also one of the members of our board of directors when we started the Denver Society of Creation. And we're so very thankful for all his work and all his support through the years. And we're very glad to have him back and to speak about a very timely topic tonight, pandemics, politics, and creation. So I think it's going to be a wonderful talk. Pastor Flamme?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. What's amazing is the last time I was here to give a talk, it was after I went to Emmanuel to become the senior pastor down there. It was one of these Hope Lutheran Church theological conferences, and I delivered a dismal paper. But yet, I've been asked back. What generosity! I want to express my gratitude to Judy, to Jim, and the whole Creation Society for the invitation to speak here tonight. I'm truly humbled. I also want to thank Pastor Olson and all the members of Hope for your generosity in providing the space so that we could have this conversation. And I hope that this talk is beneficial for you, as researching it has been beneficial for me. Now, originally Judy asked me to talk about the controversy in creation apologetics over Genesis's genealogical accounts and whether they can be used historically to calculate the age of the earth. And we use it that way, it gets to be around 6,000 years old. However, certain scholars have claimed that significant gaps exist in the recorded generations, which prevents the genealogies from being used as historical data. And that keeps us from saying anything, according to these certain scholars, about the Earth's age, at least anything with a certain degree of accuracy. Now, I think that Judy and Jim and the whole Creation Society, they understand what's at stake. Once the gaps are accepted, the status of Genesis's various other accounts that we take as history might well come into question. How are we to determine what's history and what's not? Now, this chink in what we typically assume to be Genesis's historical content might lead to familiar and depressing conclusions. Now, no doubt it would be used as an excuse for the people who want to make a synthesis between scientific authority and the Scripture's authority to say that maybe there's a way we can account for evolutionary time while still holding to some kind of biblical message. Now, this is a necessary conversation, and I hope that with sufficient research into the question we'll be able to determine whether or not the biblical text demands genealogical gaps, or if we're merely trying to insert artificial gaps to account for our desire to have science also as an authority. However, as I considered the recent history of the past 6 months, and I thought about the shifting intellectual, political, and popular climate, I thought about the Creation Society's mission. And it's this: dedicated to promoting a clear understanding of the doctrine of creation, recognizing that it is the foundation for all other Christian doctrine. Evolution and other forms of Darwinism have represented some of the greatest threats against the biblical teaching of creation. They've undermined our children's confidence in the historical reality of the biblical message. But the demonic attacks in true evolutionary fashion are changing. And yesterday's heresy is quickly set aside for something new and fashionable and what the demons, I suppose, think is more effective. Now, this is all to the devil's advantage. Being the father of lies, he can renounce his last dogma so that he can quickly pick up another. That's also why there will be a potentially infinite number of false teachings and false, I suppose, scriptures and false religions, false catechisms out there that are always waging different kinds of wars against the truth. But on the other hand, we have to consider that the devil is finite. He can't pursue every lie with equal vigor all at once. Insofar as he's bound himself to our space and our time in his attempts to tempt and mislead us, he must pick and choose his battles. And so a potential shift in demonic tactics is what I want to bring up into the conversation. I also want to talk about and suggest familiar and faithful ways to defend ourselves against these attacks. Chaos, I think, is a good way of talking about what we're seeing right now when we turn on the TV, when we watch the news, when we scroll through our news feed on our phone. Did you know they came up with a new word for this? Doom scrolling? Because that's all you see when you go from one story to the next, is this world's doom. If the world claimed to have been ruled on principles of reason and the cold standards of objective evidence and argumentation before January, I don't think that there's any way it can claim that for itself now. A couple of examples. How from reason could the New Mexico governor mandate strict restrictions on worship, even to the point of dictating to the Christian churches how they are to administer Christ's body and blood? But they never restricted, not once, the mob protests that overtook the cities of Santa Fe and Albuquerque in the wake of George Floyd's death. How, from the tried and true standards of empirical testing, I also wonder how could the prevailing scientific conclusions about the non-effectiveness of masks on the faces of the healthy people be overturned in just a matter of months? I'm not saying that masks aren't effective. That's not my point. What I am saying is that I think that other rationally minded Americans are waiting to be persuaded in these secular matters of health and safety. And I myself am at a loss. Now, I'm willing to set aside my questions for the sake of emergency and to comply with the mandates in an act of good faith. But it seems like these demands are going on indefinitely. And when they go on indefinitely, this seems contrary to my civic duty if I restrain myself from asking critical questions of the civil authorities. Especially in my state where the mandates, the health mandates, have taken on political overtones and undertones. Information is being used not to persuade the citizens of the government. Instead, in New Mexico, it's being used to force compliance. In a similar way, the media's inconsistent coverage of recent social upheavals have shaken my confidence in any sort of objectivity or claims of unbiased coverage. Major news networks have clearly been sympathetic towards the mass protests that destroy property and threaten lives, while the Christians' insistence on the rights to worship have been maligned by the experts as short-sighted and dangerous. It seems like the Fourth Estate, the so-called Fourth Estate, which is the media, have given up any pretense of following the evidence in favor of ideology and even political agenda. Though up to this point, I wasn't sure of the source and the content of their agenda. My thesis for tonight is this. We are seeing the symptoms of reason's demise in the academic, political, and popular life of this country. And this is not an accident. The current social upheaval is being driven by people who demand this irrational erosion in public conversation so that their goals of justice can be achieved. This has immediate and necessary consequences for how we think about how to conduct a Genesis-based Christian apologetic. Now, modernity used to be understood as an open, unbiased, and public intellectual space where ideas could be discussed, dissent was tolerated, and no claim was immune from conflicting evidence and argumentation. We used to call it the marketplace of ideas. If the church wanted to claim that Christ is Lord, the church in a modern, free society should and could. If science wanted to claim that reason offered alternative explanations of existence and life, then it would have the freedom to do so. It was thought that truth would prevail against falsehoods in the marketplace because of our freedom to pursue free, rational, evidence-based conversation. In this free environment, folks assumed that objective and universal truth would win out against falsehood. Now remember, it was in this theoretical forum, the marketplace of ideas, that the old orthodoxy of biblical creation was incessantly attacked by Darwinism. Nevertheless, the Christians of good faith engaged in apologetics, various kinds of rational defense against the critical claims, without demanding the absolute silencing of their detractors by force or compulsion. Such was life at the intersection between public conversation and American Christianity. But at least from a numbers and influence perspective, it's undeniable that we were losing. Agnosticism and secularism's tidal wave was relentlessly pushing back against the biblical doctrines that we taught to our children at home and at church. Nevertheless, the nature of the attacks are changing. It seemed like secularism could just keep on pushing ahead and do us in just fine. But I don't think that the devil saw it as effective enough, or ruthless enough, maybe. Now I'm going to try to shed some light on the reasons behind the phenomenon of trying to silence Christian conversation at all. And this, I hope, will indeed help us to hold fast to the biblical doctrines of creation, fall, and redemption, especially as things are changing around us. To illustrate this, I'm going to tell two anecdotal stories to illustrate, I think, better this shift away from rational modernism to irrationality. The first short story is from when I was a student at university, at Indiana University in Indianapolis, otherwise affectionately known as IUPUI. Go Jaguars, right? And it was around the year, I think, 2008. I wasn't quite done with undergraduate studies. I wasn't quite off to the seminary. And I had found my niche. I tried out all kinds of disciplines, trying to find something that engaged me rationally and intellectually. I tried out some of the hard sciences. I tried out various humanities. And then finally I stumbled into the philosophy department. And I loved it. Because even though the philosophy department was taught by men and women who certainly weren't Christian, there was a lot of generosity on their part to hear my defense for my Christian faith. They didn't mock, they didn't try to silence me. I remember once at the end of a particularly good class on David Hume, who was the famous English atheist and skeptic, my professor, after presenting all of the arguments for why Christianity is both false and Christ is not even a real human being, he asked me, now, do you still claim that Christ rose from the dead? And I said, of course. And with those words, he ended the class, and that was it. For that, I was very grateful for that department. But you know how this goes. To fulfill the requirements of the degree, sometimes you have to step outside of your comfort zone and take another kind of class. I saw on the catalog this class called The History of Television, and I thought to myself, how wonderful. I'm going to go to class, they'll tell me to watch a bunch of TV, I'll write a paper, and it'll be done. Now, I had no idea what I was getting into. It was there that I first heard the terminology of interlocking systems of oppression. And I first experienced the lecturers' militant calls for student activism, even to the point of encouraging a public book burning because of the price of textbooks. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that the exorbitant prices that colleges charge for textbooks is a great example of corruption and abuse in academia. Nevertheless, my latent faith in modernism's project caused me to recoil in horror at the idea of burning books, even if there were books that I disagreed with. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And so I refused to engage with it. I just kept my head down. I fulfilled the class requirements. I took my grade, and I thought to myself, this must be a case of a teacher who's just gone a little bit crazy, an isolated phenomenon, no big deal. Now, my second story is about my time at the Missouri Synod Convention a little over a year ago in Tampa. Is Pastor Milius here? I didn't see him come in. Okay. Well, whenever he comes around, you can ask him about his experiences there, or ask Jim and Judy and see whether or not they can confirm what I say. Now, the Concordia University in Selma, Alabama had to be closed for financial reasons. It had to be mentioned at convention, this closure, to honor the school's impact on past students and to lament its loss, as you should with any closure of an influential institution. But then the accusations from the convention floor started. And they came against the leaders of the Concordia University system, against honorable men like Dr. Wendy, and against our synodical leadership for letting something like this happen. And this is what I wrote about this episode for my circuit's formal report. No proof of wrongdoing was brought forward. Only the vague public accusations of institutional racism and malice against the black churches and members of the LCMS. Now, as I was listening to the outrage coming from the convention floor, I couldn't help but notice the overlap in the language that I had been hearing from the activists in the secular realm with the activism that was springing up among us in a church context. Now, this language at the time, and probably until very recently, was quite meaning-laden, it was clear, but it was also very obscure. I didn't understand it. But I thought that the most disturbing part was the verbal attackers didn't want to offer proof. It was as if their accusations were enough to justify their anger and their slander. This is an anti-modern way of doing business. I believe now this is a glimpse of how all public discourse is about to be conducted. Both these episodes, from my time in undergraduate and also from our Synod's convention, they're pointing to a related problem. It's not merely about a general loss of confidence in rational argumentation and the quest for truth, but it certainly starts there. I have a PowerPoint, I should use it. Here we go. You see this? This is why I wanted my summer vicar to work the computer for me. It's all right, Marcus, you can sit in the back. It's okay. So, widely accepted among academics is modernity's project to arrive at universal truth through scientific and rational means is dubious and defunct. The thought in and of itself isn't that outlandish, in fact. The modern project of establishing rationally justified beliefs is often called foundationalism. Have you heard of this before, foundationalism? Let me try my best to describe it. Alvin Plantinga, the famous Christian apologist, defines it like this. A belief is acceptable for a person if and only if it is either properly basic, which is self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to the senses for that person, or believed on the evidential basis of propositions that acceptable, I must have done a misspelling there, I'm sorry, on the basis of propositions that support it, so deductively, inductively, and abductively. Now this sounds very comfortable and familiar. And a classic example of this at the beginning of the Enlightenment is René Descartes' thought experiment that stripped away all of his preconceived notions of what is true and false, and he's wanted to rebuild a system of knowledge on an underlying truth that was unshakable. And that's where you come up with the famous Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Not that I think myself into existence, mind you, but that I think, therefore, I can be certain of my own thinking existence. This was sufficient to Descartes' view to start building out a new web of knowledge that could be rationally justified through its grounding in indubitable facts, rather than organizing his thought and life according to mere conjecture or opinion. The problem is that what we used to consider properly basic beliefs, things like that our senses give us reliable information about the outside world upon which we can base our true justified beliefs, or that it is possible as an observer to check my biases sufficiently to observe in a very objective and unbiased manner. These have proven themselves to be, in the academic world, not as foundational as we might have assumed. Now, getting into the details of this would take us too far afield. What's important is to know that this opinion has force, and many people believe it. The trouble is like this. Our modern project of building up truth claims on other truth claims rests apparently less on a solid foundation of stone, and it's more like interlocking branches of a tree disconnected from a trunk. They're just floating out there without anything definitive holding it to an objective and outside world. Again, it's not my purpose to fully explain this or to defend it. Just realize that this has taken our institutions of higher learning, especially in the humanities up to this point, by storm. As this was developing in academia 30 years ago, some Christians thought they saw an opportunity for us to re-engage in a pluralistic conversation that might leave room for faithful Christians to have their say. You see, they felt like they were being boxed out of public conversation because of the advances in a cold, hard, objective science. But now, in this new age of pluralism, the Christians could get a seat at the table along with everybody else. But as the world pivoted from the old Enlightenment foundations of modernism to what is generally called postmodernism, rather than finding space to engage with our unique and authentic Christian message, the Academy insisted on new and impervious orthodoxies. They excluded, rather than included, the Christian voice. Now, first I should say something about what we mean about postmodernism. It's notoriously hard to define. But Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, in their book, Cynical Theories, they say this: at the heart of the postmodern term is a reaction to and rejection of modernism and modernity. According to Enlightenment thinking, objective reality can be known through more or less reliable methods. Knowledge about objective reality produced by the scientific method enabled us to build modernity and permits us to continue doing so. For postmodernism, by contrast, reality is ultimately the product of our socialization and lived experiences as constructed by systems of language. Can you sense the shift there, going from relying on a truth that's outside of us, that's objective, that we can measure, that we can talk about, on a playing field outside of ourselves to a new reality, a new existence that's defined on subjective terms. Those authors have identified 2 principles and 4 themes that help us to understand what it means, and how this has given birth to what is called capital T theory in the academy. It's kind of like one theory to rule them all. I should use my slides so you can look at this. Those are the 2 principles. Those are the 4 themes. The first principle is the postmodern knowledge principle, which is radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable, and a commitment unobtainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism. Cultural constructivism, by the way, means that humans are so tied to their cultural framework, which for us, I suppose, would be a person who lives in Aurora that attends a Lutheran church, right? That grew up in something that was pretty close to a traditional idea of a mom and dad family. Yeah, like humans are so tied to their cultural frameworks that all truth or knowledge claims are merely representations of those frameworks. We have decided that it is true, or that it is known, that the earth goes around the sun because of the way we establish truth in our current culture. Clearly, you can see the consequential denials of our, what I would take to say, our naive realism and our trust in a basic correspondence theory of truth. This is not the mild skepticism that was being taught as a modern virtue. The identification and dismantlement of the meaning-generating meta-narratives, as they're called in postmodernism, they find their justification in this principle, that objective knowledge and truth is unobtainable. The second principle is the political principle, a belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how. It's from this principle that language ceases completely to be a system of signs to communicate between one another. If not objective truths, then at least subjective apprehensions of the outside world that we have. No language here is about one thing: power, of having it, and oppressing others with your language, or not having it, and having the justification to grab that power for yourself. Or as Pluckrose and Lindsay put it, power decides not only what is factually correct, but also what is morally good. Power implies domination, which is bad, whereas subjugation implies oppression, the disruption of which is good. Western science, philosophy, and even math serve a political purpose, according to this understanding, of undergirding the oppressive systems of power that keep disenfranchised people down and prop up who else but white males. Now these principles result in the 4 themes of blurring boundaries, as in the boundaries between objectivity and subjectivity, but also, importantly, between man and woman. 2, the power of language, such that language's use constructs and reinforces a person's perceived reality and consequently can be deconstructed to suit a political purpose. 3, cultural relativism, that keeps a more powerful system of knowledge and truth from standing in judgment over another. And finally, 4, the loss of the individual and the universal. The last theme has deep consequences for both you who assume, has deep consequences for you and how you assume to fit into this world. The authors describe identity, who you essentially are, as the result of powerful discourses and culturally constructed knowledge. There is no moral agent acting in agreement with or against what is universally taken to be right. A person belongs to a collective that is either oppressing or being oppressed, that deserves to be torn down because it's an oppressive regime, or lifted up. At some point in the 90s, and I indeed heard the euphemism repeated often enough during my time in university and seminary, it became popular to say that postmodernism is dead, that its ideas have been played out and they can go no further. Now, I wish that was the case. Sadly, rather than being forgotten as irrational and hopeless reactions to modernity's many failures, it's been weaponized for revolutionary action in the popular and the political realms. And that is precisely what we're seeing right now. Pluckrose and Lindsay trace theories, and by theory they mean postmodern theory's evolutionary story. Between the late 1980s and roughly 2010, theory developed the applicability of its underlying concepts and came to form the basis of entirely new fields of scholarship which have since become profoundly influential. These new disciplines, which have come to be known loosely as social justice scholarship, co-opted the notion of social justice from the civil rights movements and other liberal and progressive theories. You might have heard of studies such as post-colonialism, or gender studies, or critical race theory. But rather in being interested in describing the world according to scientific and rational method, their singular goal is deconstruction and activism, to reshape the world according to their new power dialectics and according to their new boundary-destroying ideas of justice. The authors write, those social sciences and humanities scholars who took theoretical approaches began to form a left-wing moral community rather than a purely academic one. An intellectual organ more interested in advocating a particular ought rather than attempting a detached assessment of is. An attitude we usually associate with churches rather than universities. Do you remember in university your professors teaching you about the is-ought distinction, right? It goes something like this. If you see one person killing another, the philosopher, professor, whoever, would tell you, take a microscope, go over there, and find the wrongness and report back to me, right? Ought belonged to the realm of where morality was cultivated by men's moral convictions and by religion. Is was determined by scientific study. That distinction between ought and is, these authors are saying, has disappeared. Hence the activism that I was hearing in the classroom as far back as 2008. They trace this story to the conclusion that the universities have not, for some time, been training up scholars for the past 15 years, but activists convinced of theory and now in positions of power in media and politics who have every intention of enacting their postmodern revolution. And I think that the truth of these claims is evident. The very use of language is shifting around us. Racist no longer means that you personally have biases against people who look different from you. That's what it used to mean, but it cannot mean that anymore. It's now accepted that it means that you belong to an oppressive system that cannot be redeemed, but must be destroyed. No personal apology is sufficient to satisfy the cries for justice. Only uniform compliance and participation in the language of their project of dismantlement. Now, it might be well countered that postmodernism's methods might be turned against its known new activism to dismantle itself. And you would be right. except the social justice activist scholars have established and enshrined their own foundationalism that cannot be questioned, let alone deconstructed. Flamme, Rose, and Lindsay explain that Descartes' bedrock of certainty, I think, therefore I am, was given new life under the axiomatic acceptance of a new existential bedrock. I experience oppression, therefore I am. And therefore, as a consequence, there are such things as dominance and oppression. This is the new objective reality. Now, you have heard the word, or the words, I should say, identity politics. And this is where they came from. An identity is a cross-section of oppressions. Woman is real because woman experiences oppression from a dominant system of power, namely man. Queer is real because queer experiences the oppression of gender and sex distinctions. If you subjectively belong to multiple oppressed groups, guess what? Your reality becomes even greater. This is what is known as intersectionality. You've heard this word being used. It's the nexus of experienced oppressions that define who a person is. Being defined by anything else outside of yourself, anything other than the experienced oppression, is called violence. Now imagine what this means, just for a second. Just take a step back. God's creative ordering is necessarily, according to this dogma, violence. It cannot be engaged with. It cannot be entertained as a hypothesis. The Word of God in this context can only be silenced and stopped. Consequently, the old postmodern principles and its shift towards activism have been modified to include the objective reality of oppression and identity defined by oppression, and the moral imperative to change the language of the world to oppress the old oppressors. Which again brings us to the point that I made just a few moments ago. Scholarship and activism have become one. Social justice is succeeding in its objectives of catechizing and changing the world. What started as obscure and irrational academic theories have become mainstream. And you'll hear its language parroted by politicians, news anchors, celebrities, and increasingly family. Its discourse of power structures and systems of oppression have found their way into the church. Now, if we hadn't had to reckon with their use of language and their condemnations of belonging to an oppressive system that must be destroyed, if we haven't had to deal with it yet, we will soon. Now, that's enough, I think, of pessimism and doom. The question is, what does this mean for Christ's church, and what does this mean about the future of Christian apologetics in a social justice context? Now, David asks this question in Psalm 11. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? It seems hopeless. Without an objectively true bedrock to stand on, that not even my enemy will recognize, what are we to do? What can we say? The answer is both to remember where the Lord is and what He loves. David says in response, the Lord is in His temple. The Lord Jesus, who is indeed ascended to the right hand of the Father. St. Paul writes, who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died. And furthermore, who is risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? The accusations of the social justice crowd? I think not. Remember, like David does, that in heavenly majesty and power your Redeemer rules over all things, even the turns and the shifts of history. David says, the Lord's eye beholds. The Lord sees His people and He tests them. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence his soul hates. Upon the wicked he will rain coals, fire and brimstone, and a burning wind. This shall be the portion of their cup. That means that whatever the ideological movement against truth and against God's word, it's doomed. It cannot win. And so social justice's demands to the end of fundamental institutions like the church that teach an ordered creation, a distinction between creator and created, a distinction between man and woman, right? And the demands to end family, ordered society, they will not succeed. Now, there may be an open conspiracy that's been sharpening its fangs to get ready to devour God's creation and redemption, but the Lord knows exactly what's going on. More than that, He remains in power, reigning in mercy from the Father's right hand, and His reign upholds the estates that He created and redeemed. The church, even if it falls into the errors of using the world's language and the world's ways, right? It is always reformed and brought back to the truth by the Word. The family is sanctified by prayer, devotion, and blessing. And the government is confirmed in the gospel as God's sword against evil and injustice, no matter how bad things become. Nevertheless, as long as we endure in the church on earth, persecutions will never leave the church alone. Even if their tone and tenor change as Satan thinks he can gain advantage. And so as we shift from the modern persecutions that came from reason, that resulted in Darwinistic justifications of murder, especially I'm thinking of the unborn and the elderly who didn't count as persons, to a postmodern hatred of whatever it defines as oppressive, remember that Jesus said to expect it. He said, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me before you. Jesus also describes the religious zeal grounding the desire to silence the truth. Indeed, the hour is coming, Jesus says, when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. And indeed, everything being done in the name of social justice is, in their eyes, justified. It's true that theist God is not justice in any form that we would recognize. Their justice is the end of any organizing and defining principle other than their own. So they will necessarily hate God's law. They will necessarily hate God's gospel. The justification of the ungodly by faith in Christ, which frees not just from God's judgment against sin in general, but from sins that each individual himself has committed, that has to be rejected. Now, if theory demands the denial of the individual and the universal, the biblical accounts certainly demand it. God created not just man in general, He created Adam. And it's just as well said that God did not just create Adam, He created man. Though theory denies what is objective and universally binding, the biblical message will not let us give these truths up. Notice what is different from the modernity that came before. With a modern person, you could appeal to universal laws that order nature. You could appeal to morality that bound all men together in bonds of love. These apologetic avenues don't exist in their eyes, appealing to how your individual righteousness, how you are individually righteous, I should say, and you have not committed the atrocities witnessed against minorities in the world. That's irrelevant. In fact, it doesn't even make linguistic sense to the acolytes who have been inducted to the gnosis of social justice. What matters is that you participate in a system that perpetuates racism, and there's nothing to be done but helping to tear whatever that system is down. Now, despite their language games of constructing reality according to their own desires, their confidence in human words to shape reality and truth are grossly overestimated. And this is to our advantage, especially from the standpoint of Genesis. We know that only the Lord's word creates. Their words deconstruct and corrupt, like all other satanic words that came before them. Eventually their project will fail because it offers nothing positive and lasting in the wake of its destruction. And if you try to think logically through what comes after the systems of oppression are obliterated, which they don't think that anybody can do, the oppressed will of course become oppressors. And they themselves will also be demanded to be torn down. Now, I don't think, if it ever came to such straits, that Western civilization, Christianity, and marriage would ever get off the hook in their eyes. We would still be the bad guys. Nevertheless, the fragile dialectics of power must end in nothing. It's just another culture of death, but we Christians have the durable dialectics, the way of using words of love. God's words of creative order. We use His own words of law. Yes, even the redeeming words of forgiveness and mercy that this movement knows nothing about. My guess is that our apologetic, our defense, will largely depend not on capitulating to their magical use of language and its games. The imperative will be for us to retain, as St. Paul calls it, the sound pattern of words handed down to us not only by the Holy Scriptures, but also from our fathers, who rejoiced in what is true, excellent, and beautiful. It becomes as simple as Christian men continuing to marry women, Christian women, and women continuing to give themselves in marriage as God demonstrates this order in Genesis. It's as simple as having children. It's as simple as insisting on taking your kids to church. They must learn love, because social justice will only obsess about power. Most importantly, if our silence and stubbornness only escalate their hate, because silence is indeed violence, according to the popular book, White Fragility, then we might profit from learning Christ's own example in meekness and humility when He suffered. The Jews and Pilate tried to force Jesus into categories contrary to God's promises of redemption first proclaimed in Genesis 3:15. But rather than answering, rather than playing their games of language and corrupted senses of and getting involved with their corrupted sense of justice and power, our Lord was like a lamb before His shearers, silent. He answered Pilate not a word. If anything, once the screaming of the trial was over and the sentence was passed and accomplished, only then Jesus opens His mouth to provide His apologetic. And it is one of forgiveness and blessing of persecutors. I don't think we should underestimate our Lord's submission. When He died, the centurion, a Roman man, cried out, "Truly, this was the Son of God. And also, this was a righteous man." Now, I pray that the Creation Society continues its apologetic works of countering Darwinism as it must. But I pray that it also begins to meditate on how to confess Genesis's biblical foundations of ordered life and mercy in the face of greater threats against the church and its children that may come against us in this generation. Thank you for listening to the presentation. There was a lot going on there, and I stopped again my slides like halfway through. But I'm curious to hear any thoughts or questions, or if you, questions of understanding and also questions of engagement. Yes?
Well, it was kind of a weird experience, getting getting exposed to this. It was like this Facebook thing. Like I'm accused of being a racist without any basis of being a racist. And it's kind of weird because I read up on how they're using all these terms. And I'm going, okay, that's not the historical meaning of any of these words. So it's like, it's kind of funny because it's like, first, you redefine a word, and then you call somebody that word, and somebody reacts based on the old meaning of the word, and then that confirms in your own mind their white fragility or whatever, because clearly they, you know, they're so sensitive and whatever, and you can see, you know, it just kind of confirms in their own mind their own belief system. And it was just bizarre, this whole redefinition of terms and words and stuff. The stuff, I mean, so now, like, real racism, real white supremacists, you know, all those things that were just so horrible and that everybody agrees are bad, are now redefined as something lower, and so to me, it diminishes the evil of what used to be called. It's like, you know, real evil is like not even talked about.
Right, and the key thing to remember about this is not an accident. This is on purpose. The redefinition of terms, the infusions of new meanings into phrases and language keeps us on the outside of whatever conversation that they're having. So any engagement that you have with these folks will not be, at least from their point of view, a genuine engagement, but rather a kind of violence against their undeniable orthodoxy, their dogmas. And it's meant to be that way. So by virtue of belonging to a system of oppression, of belonging to, let's say, what we call maleness, right? Or the Christian church, or Western civilization, or even what they are increasingly calling white supremacy. You do not have the right to engage with them, let alone convince them. Everything that you say, and even if it's as loving and understanding as possible, according to their own leaders, and what they tell their acolytes to see this as is again violence. Okay, Mike.
I was going to say, what's wild to me is that when I was growing up, you know, they had us read 1984 in school, you know, liberals, to teach us about the dangers of this kind of manipulation of language and so forth, and redefining of terms. Oh my gosh, I never thought I would see this occurring in our time.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
So, yeah, this is very interesting. The book that I used to get those two principles, the knowledge principle and the political principle of postmodern theory, also their four themes, this comes from two secular modern people who are of the academy. And what they are lamenting is the death of modernity and the rational foundation for doing scholarship, conversation, engaging with politics and public life. What's sad, though, is I think that instead of diagnosing a patient and prescribing a medicine, which for them is, by the way, more modernity, I think they're doing a post-mortem. It's a really good post-mortem. It's a really great autopsy. It's excellent in tracing the line of thought and the intellectual development of postmodernism into social justice activism. But nevertheless, I do wonder if it's possible for the tide to be turned through the efforts of modernity. I mean, if it can't justify itself to its own academics, then how can it hope to claw its way back into prominence in public society? I don't know. I mean, maybe by God's grace, He uses one pagan to punish another, right? So He used the Babylonians to topple the Assyrians. And even though it all ended up bad for the Israelites, it was according to God's good and gracious will for His faithful people. And in that way, maybe modernity and reason comes back and strikes back and takes its place at the head of the academy and thinking society. But we can't assume that as Christians. We have to be prepared to deal with people who will take any words that we say as complete attack and violence. And it demands from us as Christians, we have in carefully choosing our words, how should we use them? We can't stop confessing. We know that. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, that if you acknowledge me before men, I will acknowledge you before my Father who is in heaven. But if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father in heaven. We must confess. But we hope, and I pray, that we confess in such a way that we can defend ourselves, right? That we can protect our own integrity, which probably means that we confess without capitulating to their language games. We're very distinct in what we mean by terms like justification and justice, and even racism, to say that racism is a personal problem. It has to do with a personal moral fault. We will hold to personal responsibility when the rest of the world rejects it. I think those are the things that we have to start thinking about. Yes?
Yeah, a couple things. One, I was at the convention also, and I agree with your comments on Selma.
Yeah, so
for what you said there.
Yeah, so that was what we saw with the outrage against the Selma closing wasn't an argument about something that was objectively wrong. There was no evidence of wrongdoing whatsoever. Instead, there were just claims of institutional racism, right, and bigotry.
Yeah,
And then when we asked where's the evidence, there was nothing. There was nothing at all. And that was on purpose, and that's how it will always be argued. And this wasn't just, by the way, I should let everybody know, Selma being a traditionally African-American Concordia campus, right? You would assume that maybe it was just the African-Americans who would stand up and yell at the people who were up on the stage, but it wasn't. There was a score of people from all over the floor standing up to make those same social justice points. That already, in the Missouri Synod, they had been co-opted by this use of language. And they've already been programmed to achieve its goals. Yeah.
Then the other thing I wanted to mention, I liked your analogy of the interweaving branches and how they're there, but they don't tie to the trunk and the foundation.
Yes.
You know, that comes out in a lot of places. One is in the LGBT issues. You know, those are always evaluated even by the courts by paralleling them with sex and race issues and so forth, when really it's a religious issue. It ought to be tied and compared with religion, because that's where the difference is, man and woman, and the offshoots of that only attack religion, not race and sex. And the other thing, Darwinian evolution, reading a book on that right now, you know, they always tie that to science versus creation.
Right.
When really, Darwinian evolution is a religion.
Yes. And
you got to have tremendous faith to believe in Darwinian evolution, because the science always comes in and supports creation.
Yeah, that's right.
But it leaves the church out on both of these issues, and so it's like the interweaving branches and the arguments there. You can't get them tied to the foundation.
That's right. Whatever moral, objective truth and foundation that the church was able to provide to civil society in the past is now more or less not there. You know, people aren't going to go, your newspaper's not going to call up the new local Lutheran pastor to get his opinion on the latest and greatest changes in civil society. He's lost that influence. I also like what you said about Darwinism being a religion. And this is part of the problem with Christianity's old comforts with modernism. I read this great paper about how in the 19th century, in the 1800s, here in the United States, Christianity and science were best buds. You know why? Because the Christians believed that the book of science, being authored by God, could not lie and would lead us into the same exact truths of the Holy Scriptures. That was their absolute confidence. But then Darwin and others like him step up and say, well, as a rational, objective human being, looking at the data, I'm telling you that the book of nature says, right, life comes from some kind of chemical accident and a cycle of death. That's what he says. And then this paper that I was reading was talking about how the American evidentialists of that century were just completely cut off at the knees. They didn't know how to counter Darwinism and understand that part of their inability to do so was with their absolute faith in science's project of gaining and retaining true knowledge. It's in some ways like this, that the American Christians of the 1800s forgot that sin corrupts the scientific observer. To twist even his observations of the data to fit into anti-God arguments. Right? And so in that way, you're absolutely right. It's saying that Darwinism arose not so much from science, but from a religious, an anti-religion against Christianity, right? Any other thoughts about this? Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's interesting sometimes seeing in the news what I would identify traditionally as a powerful person, identifying himself as an oppressed person, and vice versa. You know, maybe oppressed people identifying themselves as oppressors and lamenting that. And I don't know if you can comment on that. It's obviously some blurring of the boundaries.
Yeah, so what I've been reading about this lately is that the modern secular people who are alarmed by what's going on, right? The people who belong to the old modernism who want that to come back. What they are really afraid of are the religious over and undertones of confessing as an oppressor your sins. Or as an oppressed person demanding the confession of sins from a whole crowd of people. And there are even pictures on the news, right, of people kneeling down before others, saying that we are the oppressors. You know? And then it's kind of like this, when they would grab the looters coming out of Walmart or whatever, and ask them, why are you doing this? They say, with a straight face and complete conviction, it's reparations. Right? So that their oppression of private property isn't oppression at all. It's justice. It's what's due. And it's not something that we're looking forward to. It's happening, whether we like it or not. Yes, go ahead.
Would you call that the politics of guilt and pity?
Politics of guilt and shame. Well, of course.
Of pity. Politics of guilt and pity.
I'm sorry, I'm going to move a little bit closer. I have a hard time hearing something.
Politics of guilt and pity.
Guilt and pity. Pity. Pity.
Yeah, politics of guilt and pity. Copying a plea. I won't say that I'm guilty before the living God, but I am so guilty that I have to do something. So I would say that I'm guilty of slavery in the past.
Yes. Oh, that's a great point. So is this a kind of politics or even a religion of guilt and pity? Hey, face it, the Ten Commandments are hard on us. They expose very uncomfortable truths, even to the point where we'll seek out an alternative law that exposes sins that I'd much rather confess, especially if that system downplays personal moral responsibility and lifts up a kind of a cultural or people-wide responsibility. You see, now it's not just me that have to confess my sins. I probably, secretly in my heart of hearts, feel justified, but I'm going to confess anyways and demand my brothers and sisters confess along with me. But what's left out is that sharp attack of the law, that I am a sinner. I just belong to a system that happens to be sinful, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Yeah, Mike.
I think something we have going for us is reality.
Yeah.
These principles principles are not intuitively correct. I mean, they're not in harmony with your normal intuition. And people can't live their lives this way. I mean, they can't, and this is what amazes me with academics, is they can actually be really submerged into theories and stuff that actually don't make much sense at all.
Yes.
And if they try to go on the street and teach these things to people, and they're not in a classroom environment where there's actually where the instructor is being really respected, is being the authority, they're going to have a hard time selling these ideas. And I think that I think a lot of people, I mean, normal people who haven't been brainwashed are going to see writing and recoil, you know, say this is not right. And but I don't know, they are making a big effort to try to sell this whole idea to the culture.
Yeah.
I just think it is an uphill thing because just natural revelation speaks against it.
You have I suppose to that point, you have entire generations of children who are being brought up in a secular context where the distinctions between man and woman are not real.
Yeah.
And pagan superstition was once the prevailing philosophy all over the face of the earth, and really the devil can make it happen again.
But still a lot of people want to get married, you know? I mean,
yes.
The thing is, it's like you can still, people that are have gender dysphoria are the minority. I mean, well, God made us in such a way that in general, the vast majority of men are attracted to women and vice versa. And anyway, and to some extent, I mean, I don't know how this is all going to turn out in our culture in the United States, but I do think that they have common sense going against them.
Yeah.
Because it's a deception.
Joel, did they put you into a leadership position in this congregation?
Can you believe that?
Oh my gosh.
Great. Let's take the long-haired hippie guy.
Go ahead.
Kind of to Mike's point about the reality of it is that academic intellectualists never have to really deal with the fallout or with the conclusion of their ideas. You know, somebody who's in a hard science like a civil engineering, if his engineering is incorrect, bridges and buildings collapse. So
yes.
There's an actual fallout.
Yes.
Somebody who's a social, you know, who's a professor in lesbian dance theory never has to deal with whether or not their theories are right or wrong. So
you know,
that's kind of Mike's point about dealing with reality.
There was this book that was published, I think, by Purdue, their engineering department recently, about how to incorporate the social justice principles into teaching and executing engineering.
Good luck with that.
Well,
I don't want to drive over a bridge built on it.
Right, yeah. But I think, you remember this also, it was somewhere halfway through the last 6 months of chaos, the Smithsonian came out with this, this release, this kind of press release or a media post that talked about these various indicators of systems of oppression. Do you remember what one of them was? Math. 2 + 2.
Oh, yeah,
equals
yeah,
4.
yeah.
Another example of this phenomenon. I mean, the math departments are being told to shut up, listen, and conform, and it seems like, in some cases, they're starting to. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
So the conversation is about oppression and domination now. It seems like maybe that applies to the pandemic too. Are people protesting and trying to take back the power of life and death? You know, we're being oppressed by God because He makes us die at some point.
Yeah. No, I mean, we know, we can see from many of these health and safety orders which have been going on, at least in New Mexico, without end, that apparently dying is the absolute worst thing in the world. The loss of human agency upon this earth, right?
Yeah.
Even if a pastor wants to take the personal risk to go visit a shut-in in a nursing facility, is absolutely legally forbidden. I mean, is this something that's coming out of the new dialectics of power and oppression? Maybe. Because as a Christian, even as a rational person, a modern person, a secular person who is brought up in the traditions of Western civilization, there's still an awareness that there are some things that are more human, right, than being afraid of death. But that's what it's all been reduced down to, at least among certain political powers in my state. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yes.
I think often watching things on the news, my initial response is anger. I think probably because I don't understand what I'm seeing. I don't understand. This has really helped to kind of structure the logic of postmodernism. And honestly, I didn't know what I was seeing, and it didn't confuse me. And it was also very comforting to remember you feel helpless a lot. Like, what can I do to stop this madness? How can I stop all these people from being crazy? Well, you can't. Just, like you said, keep marrying, you have your children, keep teaching them scripture, you know. That's all you really have control over, right?
Yeah. Hey, and insofar as we have Christian schools and institutions of learning, universities, seminaries that are independent, right? We should fight for them. We really have to. We have to be sure that with our existing educational institutions, that the same language that's infected the secular education world is not allowed into our Lutheran Christian educational context. It cannot in any way be allowed because of what's at stake and just how just a little bit of this language is designed to change absolutely how you think of reality. And so that's why it's good, and I'm proud to be a senior pastor of a church with a K through, not even K, it's like 3-year-old through 9th grade classical school. And we're classical on purpose, using the classical formulations of Western civilization to talk about the good, the true, the beautiful. Right. The things that the Holy Scriptures say, to think about these things, right? If it's honorable, if it's praised, right? And so that's what we teach the children. And that's what we hold to, and it's become a safe harbor for our families. The argument used to go in a more gentle, secular time, that if you give your kids too much time at church or among these parochial schools, they'll become, what was the word that was used? Sheltered. They won't be able to handle reality. That is, show me the reason behind that argument. I bet. You know? It is shelter. It's shelter from the madness that destroys any possibility of charity between yourself and another person. You know, it's shelter from these interlocking systems of oppression that want to peg you as an oppressor or the oppressed, right? As a victimizer or the victim. When we continue to fight for our Christian institutions, we're retaining exactly what I was talking about at the end of the lecture. Instead of a dialectics of power, a dialectics of love. Right? That's what we have. That's our heritage. And we need to pass that on to our children, not just in Sunday school, but in day school, and also in college. And if we don't fight for it, if we don't check against the false wisdom the world's seeping in, we'll be caught unawares, if we haven't already. Do you have anything else, Katie?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you.
All right, thank you.